I teach art studio and art history courses here, and today my brief to myself is to help you see the world and help you see how others see the world. So we imagine the world already. We create time, history, space, and all of these things are constructs, not truths. There is no truth in time. So if I'm perturbed at the tardiness of our beginning, there's nothing for me to be perturbed at because the beginning doesn't really exist in time because that's just a construct. But what we do well is that we create myths. And not all of these myths are stories about gods, but stories about ourselves, our knowledge, our understanding. And these myths help us to understand the world better. And how we do that quite frequently is through the use of figurative speech. We have one thing that stands for another thing. And there's different parts of speech and so on and so forth, but I'm not going to go into literary theory right now or linguistics or anything like that. But some humans fancy that we are the only ones on the planet that can tell stories or have the ability to describe the world through figurative thought. We imagine the world. We look at things and seek to understand them by noting how they fit into, might I say, mythical categories that we have created. Knowledge is used to separate one thing from another. And ever since we started doing that, we're trying to get back from that brink. How can we reimagine the world? How can we reimagine imagination? We're not even sure what imagination is. How can we rid ourselves of the need to describe the world, imagine the world on our own terms? So this funny-looking fellow, I'm going to follow the tradition laid out so far of heroes, is a fella named Johann Gottlieb Fichte. And this is sort of a caricature of him, and caricatures are what you're accustomed to seeing in comics and stuff. That's where you take one bit of a person or a creature of one sort or another, and you distort it or amplify it to kind of enhance the inner, or to expose the inner character of someone's being, not just their outsideness. And that little thing up there in the corner is a spruce tree. And if you were to translate his name from German, you'd end up with spruce. So I put it up there just to show you that I can actually cross some boundaries in linguistic thought. So this fellow suggests that the self, which he typically refers to as the I, is not a static thing with fixed properties, but rather a self-producing process. You got to think about that, and you're going to have to think a lot today, okay? It is not a static thing, the I, with fixed properties. I am not a fixed being. You are not fixed beings, but rather we are self-producing all the time. We're in process. And we could identify the modalities of that, whether it be aging, the acquisition of knowledge, however you want to look at it. But this meant that he was a restless philosopher because he never finished writing everything down, because he was always in process. And he never stopped the process of his own imaginings, but history stopped them for him. And so he's sort of fallen from the wayside, and so I'm rather fond of him, because you've probably heard of Kant, Immanuel Kant, and it's, ooh, hail thee, Immanuel Kant. And if you don't know about him, you will soon, I'm sure. Anyway, he was the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century philosopher, just like this fellow, who pretty much laid out some ground rules of how we are in the world, how we critique the world, how we see the world, how we judge the world, and all of these things. But he had a very clever trick. One of his great lessons was he asked for his students first to think of his or herself, and he did have female students, his or herself. Then he asked them to think of a wall opposite them. And then he asked them to close their eyes. So I'm not a spruce tree and I'm not Fichte, but I ask you to close your eyes for a minute and just do it, okay? So think of yourself. Now think of the wall opposite of you and now think what it was that was thinking the wall. And that, you can open your eyes. Okay, did you figure it out? What is there to figure out? What it does is it causes you to stop in the process of beingness and thinking, and to slow down and actually become self-conscious of your own thought, which means that you have to stop thinking about the wall to think about yourself, because it's you or this organ within you, and it goes on and on. So what is it that it was thinking the wall? What is it that's seeing the wall? That is an impossible question to answer, because so long as you are absorbed in thinking the wall, all that exists in your mind is your own presence and self-awareness. And that's the way we proceed in the world, fairly self-aware. Every once in a while, we think we go outside of ourselves through our senses. And the sense that I'm interested in talking about today is sight. And so I gave you these two readings, which we'll get into in a minute, but I'm not the kind of person that says, as you probably noticed, none of us are, read this and then I'm going to totally make it real for you. That's what you're here for. That's why you have the readings. You're the one that does that. You talk about with your colleagues about it, and then we take these times here to amplify some of the ideas or help tease out some of the major points of what was going on. So what this fella did is he basically acknowledged that thinking isn't an activity. It's an activity. To think is movingness, okay? Seeing is an activity. We've become passive seers in our society for lots of reasons, and we've been doing this for a very long time because we're so far away from the struggle for existence. Unless you're walking on a really busy street in Brooklyn, you sort of aren't aware of everything all the time. Some of us have had experiences in our lives that make us more hyper-aware. This is true, yes. But for the most part, we just move through space and time, taking our visual faculty completely for granted. And now we're spoon-fed crap on a fairly regular basis by watching what we think is the most brilliant cultural production of all time, YouTube. All right? So YouTube is just voices. And it's a flat screen. And in case you didn't realize it, it's just a bunch of pixels. It's not real. And lots of people have access to it. Thank goodness, because things have happened socially and culturally, and it's a very important agent in our world, but it's not seen, all right? So get over it. Seeing is thinking, and it's sensory. You think, and seeing is part of your senses. It's one of the provisions that your body has for interacting in the world, all right? So there's really no division between mind and body, and the last image you saw was of this Italian guy named Piranesi, who did this whole series on prisons. And it's such an ecological work, because it's all about looking at humane ways of providing incarceration for really naughty people. And at the same time, it's sort of an elegy to how our brains are. They're layered. They take us different places. They stop. There's structures that started and concluded before they were finished. It's amazing to me that our brains are what they are and do what they do, and how fragile they are. And your seeingness and the way you've been trained to see culturally reveals that fragility of the connection of the mind and the body and the brain. So what I'd like to do is help you, like all my colleagues want to help you, have a more profound relationship to the world. And up until the beginning of the 19th century, a lot of that happened from reading text. You use your eyes to read text. You text, you read. You look at some really dodgy engravings of some mythical beings that weren't really well observed, but at least they were trying to get an idea of how to make pictures of what they thought it was they were looking at. And in the 19th century, lots of things happen, like photography for one thing, that help us start to have a keener eye, but at the same time, it took us away from sensory experience. So anyway, obviously, I'm really into this stuff, and I'm really into 19th century German art. And I wrote and have written and am writing extensively about this fellow, Caspar David Friedrich, who is a fellow that's sort of fallen by the wayside. And like most artists, past or present, their popularity rises like fashion and goes away, often dependent on the market and whatever. But anyway, so I got interested in him because I was interested in the Romantic Age. I was interested in the Romantic Age because it seemed to be a time when people really plumbed the depths of human imagination. And they asked questions, really not expecting answers, all right? So this is a revelation of myself briefly. I really like this painting. And it was done the year that Friedrich was born. Wow, that would have been a miracle. It was done the year he was married to a woman named Caroline, who's in the red dress there. And he was in his 40s, and so it was kind of unheard of, really, for a man to wait that long, because he really needed someone to do stuff for him. But, you know, it's pretty amazing that he waited that long to enter into a sacrament so he could have someone do a lot of stuff for him. But and we know that's changed today, for sure. But at any rate, he did marry her, and he took her on long walks. And they had a pretty great marriage. He got paranoid later on in his life, but that was for other reasons that we won't go into right now. But he really had a direct connection with the world because he walked all the time. And this is one of the journeys he took with his wife, Caroline, and his brother-in-law over there to the chalk cliffs of Rügen, which is, Rügen is this beautiful island that's been totally spoiled in the Baltic Sea. And all along the northern, I'm getting my directions wrong, and I have good directionality. I'm forgetting for a minute. But all along a certain part of the coast, they're chalk cliffs. And you read about geology, and you read about the history of the Earth, and you read about the pictures people started to make, and how they tried to describe the edges of the world abstractly, and to provide data and information along the way. But what that article, the flaw of that article in a way, was not to include a wider range of visual culture, like the art paintings that people were made, that were singular, that weren't printed in books, that weren't attached to text, that could be objects of contemplation, and so on and so forth. And this is really a wonderful work, and I've always quite loved it, even though I think some people find it sort of silly and kind of corny. But it's really beautifully painted, for one thing, if you're in the presence of it, and we're not. We're in the presence of a bunch of light. But at any rate, what he did was he didn't accept all the geological stuff that was fashionable at the time. It was a great fashion to go out and look for rocks and look at cliffs and look at long time instead of short, itsy-bitsy human time. And he really got into that a lot. But what he wanted to do was sort of subvert that idea and look at the world more through figurative speech, metaphoric speech, and pictures and images. And the way he did that was to hearken back to old knowledge, which is kind of fashionable now, that people think they understand, but they really don't. It's like people read the Kabbalah and they have no idea what they're reading. But alchemy, okay? So if you've read Harry Potter, you've heard of Nicholas Flamel and all that stuff. He really did exist. And Garrison Keillor talked about him today on NPR in the morning, which I thought was really cool. But anyway, so the one premise of alchemical thought, and there's many, so I shouldn't say there's just one, is analogy. What is above is like that which is below. And what is below is like that which is above. And so all the things of the world are a reflection and are in relationship to one another. They're not different. Their edges meet. So when you look at Caspar David Friedrich's work, you see that he kind of capsizes what it's like to look down at the cliffs, because what he does is He makes the view of the sea and the sky like a mountain that is plummeting to where they are on this edge of the world. And you'll just have to trust me that there is a keen difference between looking at this image in this particular state, where it's blown up much larger than it is. It's an easel painting, so it's about like that. And being before it. Because when you are before it, and now this is going to be controversial, so hold on to your hats. Objects have aura. Objects have energy. It took energy to make them, and they exist on the same plane of existence as we do, and it's potent, concentrated energy. And I truly believe that as an artist and an art historian. And I would like you to truly believe that, because that way you don't separate yourself from the things of the world. There's more things in the world than you'll ever know. And if you separate yourself and categorize each and every one of them and draw lines of otherness, your understanding can't even begin to strive to become comprehensive, which it can't be anyway, so that's a bummer. So at the same time he made his image of geology, the exact same year, this fellow, Carl Gustav Carus, who was a gynecologist and an anatomist and a student of Caspar David Friedrich, was very interested in learning how to paint and, learning how to be in geological relationship with the world. So he started walking a lot. And what was happening is people were finding themselves walking down instead of walking up. Because it used to be to find any sort of inspiration, you had to go to the top of the mountain. You couldn't possibly go down into the ditch. But if you go down into the ditch, you're closer to what came before you. And what came before you is an accumulation of knowledge and existence that you can't even begin to understand. So we might as well all be running around on our hands and knees to get to know the world better. That's my personal thought. So this image of cliffs and time is very different than this image, but they're very much related in temperament, because you have a human figure with his and her back almost to us, the spectator, not looking at our world, but looking at the world of nature. And that doesn't sound very revolutionary, but it was pretty revolutionary back then, that our attention would be turned from our cultural world that we hold separate from nature into a world that we can behold, all right? So John had us read Lauren Isley, which was a fantastic experience for me. Thank you. It was wonderful to return to that text and to remember that once death wasn't natural, and that life wasn't natural, and that death was a symbol of something, of otherness, rather than something that happens to all of us. Okay, I predict, write this down, 500 years we'll all be dead. No one's contesting me. All right, so death is natural, and Caspar David Friedrich still thought of it as symbolic and natural at the same time. And so he would make images, and this is a sepia drawing. It's about this big. It's all ink. It's all beautiful ink. Unfortunately, it was made from bits and bobs of a whale, which is a whole other ecological issue about art that I could never explore in the short amount of time that I'm given. So I'm showing you this to show that death was considered definitely by the evidence that was all around us, and in order to understand it more deeply within our cultural parts, we start to make pictures of it in a particular way that hadn't been done before. So does anyone know who this artist is? You'll never guess. It's one of your favorites. It's Vincent van Gogh. And here it is, hanging in the, and it was on David Sedaris' book. Really good paintings from the 19th century end up on the covers of books, and it gives me nightmares, but I won't go into that. Paintings are worth so much more than being relegated to the covers of paperbacks, but you know, what have I? Anyway, so Vincent van Gogh went and was trained briefly as an artist because he just didn't have the temperament to be told to do anything that he didn't want to do. And so he was asked to do the typical exercise that some painters do, which I find very valuable, frankly, and that is to make a painting of a skull and of a body. And so he just stuck a cigarette in its mouth and called it a day. Now, it seems like this image now has died to us because it's in one of those places that some people reject, museums. And I used to buy that line of thought, that museums are just dead things by dead people, mostly men, that why bother? And now I find them to be really quite valuable because I see museums as being quite akin to archives of documents and archives of stone, that they're joined together in a particular way, and other artists have feel that, so they borrow. What we do is sometimes we appropriate. Now, you're not going to believe what this is. This isn't a painting. It's actually a really highly technically printed, they call them giclées, which is a ridiculous name. It's just a inkjet image, but don't even get me started on that. But what it is, it's by this artist named Chris Jordan, and it's 98 inches by 72 inches. So he's blown up the size. You can see that previously it was very small scale. In fact, our head would fit in that skull, which was the whole point, that we would come up to that, and it would be like a memento mori or a reminder of death. We would know that we, as I once was, you shall be, as you once were, I was, something like that. So what Chris Jordan did was, you know, wow, cigarettes. You know, I happen to know that every 6 months, 200,000 Americans die from lung cancer from smoking cigarettes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 200,000 cigarettes and make death. So it's not paint, it's pictures of cigarette boxes. Isn't that cool? But what it does is it, in a sense, it demystifies visual culture by putting it right in our lap with, you know, unfortunately, there's more cigarette pack and cartons being printed today than fine art prints, okay? So, poor Van Gogh. This is a real Van Gogh. This is from the end of the 19th century, 1889, and you know, he only painted for about 10 years, and speaking of myths, there's all kinds of myths about Van Gogh, which actually are factually true. But he really was still very much interested in the development of scientific knowledge in the time, and instead of the history of Earth stuff, like the German Romantics were interested in, he was more interested in the struggle for existence. So he could do an image like this, of this beautiful, these peach blossoms just blooming. This is in London's Courtauld. It's about that big. And it's really luscious. It looks like you could drag your finger through the surface and it would just give way. It's soft and buttery. And it's back when they made pigments with little bits of pigment that were of different sizes. So, and this is a chemical lesson, therefore structurally the light had more surfaces to land on and they were at different angles. So that's why those old paintings look so bright and beautiful and fresh. And you wouldn't know that unless someone told you, so I'm telling you. So he also made images of laborers and people. And he was very interested in popular publications of the time. And I think the Illustrated London News was mentioned in one of the readings, and the graphic, which sort of exemplified a new sort of human sensitivity to the downtrodden. But this is usually how everyone looked. It was sort of a hygienic view, in a sense, so that you could look at it and feel for these people and have some kind of relationship with them. But as I told my reality effect class earlier in the week, this is a radical incomprehensibility. because you can't imagine what it's like to be someone that's working in the field for 14 hours a day, and that eventually goes home not all clean and fresh and smiling and happy from a good Christian Protestant day of work, but you go home and you eat the few rotten potatoes that are left. And this is Vincent van Gogh. This is his Potato Eaters, which is dark and dank and musty and whatever, but it's so much true, and it's so dark, actually. But if you see it in person, and when it's projected in a way that you could actually see all the wonderful layers of colors, you can see that this is a much more dignified reception of the struggle for existence of the laborer and worker in the 19th century than something like this. But this was easier to take. Okay, so artists are so great. Okay, so let's get back to natural history images, because that's sort of where our interests lie. And I would argue that almost everything we've looked at so far are a reflection of some sort of vein within the body of natural history. But just for the heck of it, these are starlings. They're Sardinian starlings. And they're beautiful lithographs that were hand-colored. So lithography is an invention of printmaking within the 19th century that came about because people wanted more easily to be able to reproduce sheet music. But artists picked up on it. And this one fellow and this one woman picked up on it, and their names were John and Elizabeth Gould. And much to everyone's chagrin, John Gould wasn't the artist, it was Elizabeth. John Gould was the business person that organized everything, figured out how to spend the money, figured out what markets to go into, and at the same time, John Gould also could not stand the guts of Darwin. He was really displeased that Darwin was taking the divine out of the mix of creation. And so, interestingly enough, if you look at these illustrations of birds, for instance, of this particular period of time, they read to us as being equivalent to one another because we don't have the ability to discern the small, little, tiny differences between them. They all look alike to us. But if you read more closely, and I'm not going to do that for you now, I'm going to ask you to do that. If you look at images that Darwin had done of his finches and compare them to what Gould did, I don't know if you'll be able to do it this term or if you'll be able to do it next year, but you're going to see that there's a difference of treatment. And I ask you to do that. And it's not an assignment. You can just try it. Okay, so I'm really into starlings, and I'm really into painting, and I'm really into Hans Holbein, even though he was a butt-kissing painter for Henry VIII. But, my God, what a painter he was. And there's some question that Lauren Isley was kind of not maybe a very nice person, and it's amazing sometimes how the people we admire aren't these ideals of what we project them to be, but that's another thing. So here's a starling. I just put it up there because here's some starlings. And here's a starling that was made 300 years before the ones we just saw. And of course, it's located to the side of this woman who we think is probably the daughter of the martyr Sir Thomas More. You know, Sir Thomas More. Anyway, the painting did survive. And this is one of those things for me that has an aura, so that when I go and visit this, I'm not just feeling the presence of the female sitter, but the little squirrel and the starling and all of that. And it was done 3 years differently. So, I mean, separated in time from the other image we saw. But there's something about the way humans creatively look sometimes that makes common ground. But common ground of looking changes a lot when we get to the 20th and 21st century. So you look at this starling, who I think you could probably tell is a little out of scale. This is the artist Walton Ford. I think I put his name up there. Yes, I did. And you can see that this starling, instead of being something that we could behold right next to us on the wall and gush over the beauty of the woman and the squirrel and or study in our lap and be mental travelers in relationship to these pictures of starlings, what Walton Ford does is he dwarfs us and he inverts the relationship of scale that humans have with birds by making the bird much larger. This is an artistic trope, and it's something that seems not to be true, and it challenges our kind of a reception of visual hierarchy in the world, because we're all about size, some of us. By inverting the species in this particular way, what Walton Ford is doing is asking us to question our relationship to these creatures. And he does it in several ways. He takes passenger pigeons, in this 2002 work called The Falling Bow, and I guess you probably already know this, but there were 3 to 5 billion of these in North America before the Europeans arrived. And at one point, there was a sighting of a flock of these birds as being 1 mile wide and 300 miles long and taking 14 hours to pass a certain point in time. And they estimated that it had 3.5 billion birds just in that. And it's just astounding to me. That was about 150 years ago. But in 150 years' time, 3.5 billion birds have disappeared completely off of the face of the earth. So the lesson of Darwin and natural selection and this comprehension of death through extinction and all that stuff is something that we read about and we can conceptualize and we know is a theory, but this kind of image helps you picture it. And this image is it's a little bit smaller than this. And it's a watercolor gouache. It's beautifully rendered. And the thing about it is it looks like that if you were to walk past it and it were to fall off the wall, you would be crushed by the density of the birds. I mean, it has that much power when you look before it. So just look at the bottom of it there, because here's the bow of these 3.5 billion passenger pigeons that no longer exist, flying over this river, and it's all very wonderful because you've got this beautiful landscape. And Walton Ford is so clever that he not only borrows from natural history, he borrows from cultural American history, images that we're really fond of. And maybe some of you have seen this in your AP art history courses, and maybe you don't care. But this is by Thomas Cole, and it is an astoundingly beautiful painting from 1836 of Mount Holyoke by the Oxbow. And what Walton Ford does is he moves like a bird does and revisions what that river looks like, but he includes the tree as a marker to let us know that he was there in a way, but imaginatively. This is about reimagining the world. So if you were to take this image by Audubon of the passenger pigeon that no longer exists, and the last one died in the Cincinnati Zoo, this seems more real to us because of the conventions of visuality and how we've been taught to comprehend the picture world. So I'm asking you to start to look differently at the world and don't be afraid of your imagination, okay? You're going to have to make some decisions and choices along the way, just like artists do, and just like scientists do in their data, what they accept, what they find valid, and what they don't. But if you can stretch the boundaries of how you see when it comes time to seeing something authentically, by stretching those boundaries, you might be able to see something that no one else has noted before, okay? Someone else might have seen it before, but not everyone's running around making notes, in case you didn't notice. Okay, so this is Charlie Harper. This is his version of the passenger pigeon. This is our sort of interval of relaxation. Very different from this passenger pigeon. But if you know your passenger pigeons, which you don't because they're extinct, this might seem like a really good passenger pigeon. But you could see this bird. This is a photograph of one of Darwin's finches on the Galapagos. And that's the standard now. In the 19th century, when photography was around, it was like you can take a picture and it's there. The picture is the truth. And we've really suffered for that big time, I think, personally. Here's some more of Darwin's finches. These were painted by Elizabeth Gould, not John. And interestingly enough, as much as John didn't like Darwin, and I personally kind of like Darwin myself, so I'm not taking sides here. I do believe in evolution and stuff, but the fact is that John Gould was actually the one that made the first sort of family designation. You could say this much better than I, John. That Darwin's finches and mockingbirds had this sort of special affinity. That was probably really bad. So refer to John and Scott later about this. But at any rate, it was John who didn't believe in evolution or natural selection or any of this stuff to a certain extent. That is the one that sort of put this finch in the box that it is in now. And this is by Gould, and it's really quite beautiful. These are finches, too. These are finches, one of which is a resident of the Galapagos. And at first, when you look at this, did you think birdsong? Or did you already know it wasn't? Well, I thought birdsong because that's where I'm at. But what it is, of course, it's a graft comparing over a period of time the shape of the body, the beak size, the beak shape. It's a comparative thing. A little different from this, I think. But data, they're equivalent to a certain extent. And so some people understand pictures better than other people. And this is a picture, by the way. It's not data, it's a picture of data. It doesn't exist. It's as artificial as this is. But I sort of lean towards the Charlie Harper, Darwin's finches, just for another moment of quiet repose and not restless thought. These finches in your living room, these finches in your living room. This bird who's saying, I wish that all of you had one neck and that I had my hands on it. That's pretty harsh. The Carolina parakeet, the last living one that was in captivity, died in the same cage that Martha, the last passenger pigeon in captivity, died in the Cincinnati Zoo 4 years after. Oh, bummer. And here are a bunch of Carolina parakeets hanging out together and mourning the certain and imminent death of another parakeet. But we would never really expect them to do that. But we expect humans to do that. Wow. What if nature took over culture instead of culture taking over nature? What if you started seeing things outside of your body rather than being centered it? What if you learned how to see in a dispersed way of beholding? Well, that means you're going to have to become really aware of all of your body, not just this big hunk and heavy thing that you're carrying around and you can barely keep, balanced on your head. But you could pull off stuff like this, and it's pretty effective. It kept you awake, the people that were starting to drift. All right, so it's artificial, this division between art and science, because some of the most important, scratch that. Some artists are very good scientists, and some scientists are very good artists. And we know some of their stories and we don't know others. Like Leonardo da Vinci is sort of seen as having a scientific mind, but actually it's more about engineering, but that's a whole other question. Michelangelo had sort of an aesthetic way of appreciating the human form, but he was really scared of women, so all of his female figures looked like men because he knew male anatomy much more, because maybe he's homosexual, who knows. But there are ways of artists working in the world and being in the world that they can learn lessons in their beingness in the world, and scientists can too. So this is a sculpture made of a mountain gorilla by a fellow named Carl Ackerman, who was sent in 1921 to what is now known as what was formerly known as the Belgian Congo. He was sent out and he was told, yeah, bring back some carcasses. We want to stuff them and we want to see them. We can't have access to this. They're not surviving in the zoos. So I want you to go out there and, you know, off some of these guys and pile them in a box and try to preserve them the best you can and bring them back. So he went out there and he did it a couple times, and then he started to question that. And I have to tell you, that's a pretty major thing for someone to actually, in the process of doing something that was expected and seeing things that he expected to see as objects rather than beings, he ended up collecting a few, feeling really, really bad, probably had some nightmares, and decided that for the rest of his life he would work to create a spot of land as a preserve for these beings to live. And he accomplished that, which was really good. But his attitude was fundamentally changed because he was in the field. So you can go in the field and have your attitude fundamentally changed, not by what you think you saw and what now the stuff that you maybe know that you didn't know. You can fundamentally change in your relationship with yourself and the rest of the world, and you don't even have to take notes about it. And that makes you a better scientist and a better artist, I think. So Walton Ford decided he liked that story, and he read many stories of different encounters that gorillas had. And I don't know if you see it, but there's some feet laying down there. Unfortunately, this particular gorilla probably didn't make it, but Walton Ford sort of liked the idea and wanted to share it with us, the what if. And he even gave, not only is there sort of pathos in this particular image, which is this rhetoric that's expressed through inciting emotion within you, there's a certain ethos as well, because even the gorillas decided what he did was wrong, and so he's turning the gun on himself. But thank goodness he was so strong he twisted it first so the bullet will never make it in. And it's, you know, it kind of makes us giggle a little bit, and it's amazing when you go to children's films that are about saving nature and all of that, and at the end people just are crying and they're clapping, and I'm among them, believe me. And then we just go away. So sometimes having images that are fixed, that aren't always traveling in light, so try not to comprehend the world always through moving images. Contemplate the world, and you move the images that are before you, okay? So one of the things that I'm really tickled about is Darwin's book, looking at the expression in human and animals. And so as long as we're on the topic of primates, I thought I'd pop this up here because this is what you come upon. And I have a copy of this. And it's real fun, especially when you get to these kinds of things where it says, here's a placid expression, and here's the same when pleased by being caressed. And it's just amazing that, in fact, you could probably put that in YouTube and come up with that if you want. So this is pretty wonderful. It's sort of a transference, but it really exists. I mean, it's observed. wow, maybe ethos, logos, maybe some form of rhetoric exists in the animal world, but maybe they organize it differently, or, well, let's not go there because that's just ridiculous, isn't it? But other images are made outside of that context that, you know, oh, God, oh, you look at this image. And talk about pathos. And it is sad. In fact, I had to really think of whether I'd put this up here because I thought it might really bum you out. So I'm going to end on something more positive. But at any rate, we project ourselves in everything we do, even when we're being sympathetic and empathetic and trying to save the world. Don't project yourself. Take up the space that you have and let everyone else take up the space that they have. Okay? Okay. Cat. Savage, prepared to fight. Kitten. I mean, they got it down. And you recognize it. It's familiar. If you hung out with primates, that other image of being pleased when being caressed would be familiar to you as well. And you're probably more familiar with this. All these images are set in here. And this is from a chapter, by the way, called Joy, High Spirits, Love, Tender Feelings, and Devotion. And here are these photographs of it. And there's another chapter that looks at revulsion. Another chapter that looks at terror. Okay, now hold on to your seats and don't freak out on me. This is a wood engraving from a photograph. And it's been tampered with, in a way, because this is how they achieved the expression of terror. Now, it's okay, he survived. They were small electroshock charges right under the surface of his skin, like it's almost the same, but not quite. Actually, it's torture. But they, when you go to the doctor and the doctor checks your reflexes, this is the same sort of situation, but they were trying to see what does the body have to do with emotion, and what does the mind have to do with the body, and why does our face make certain expressions when we feel sad, whatever, and oh my God, we're seeing them in animals' faces too. Okay, this guy's great. No one was tortured in order to make this sculpture. His name is Messerschmitt, and he was mostly Austrian, and he lived in about 1770, and he was batty, would be the generous way to put it, and brilliant. And he decided that he was going to make 100 sculptures, bronze sculptures of human emotions, and he did it by observing himself in a mirror and then sculpting it, and then making bronze sculptures. I mean, the guy had a relationship with the mirror because he made scores of these images, and they're all just about life size, and they're just incredible. And these were made in 1770. 100 years before, we started to scientifically look at it. So sometimes art leads science, sometimes science leads art, and actually, sometimes they're just happening. So it's fun to look at this stuff, I think. Ugh, God, how repulsive. Oh my God. He's, don't worry, he's just a sculpture. So this Austrian fellow, you know this guy's work. Have you seen the movie Labyrinth? Oh, yeah, don't you love that movie? He didn't make it, but he worked on the creatures that are in it. And the only way that you can really do stuff like that and have it ring so true is if you have a certain kind of knowledge, and then you use something that I mentioned when I first showed you an image of a person, caricature. You amplify, you distort, you bring out other qualities, so that it increases the understanding. What if our eyes, and some of us have this, by the way, some of us don't see everything in 20/20 vision, and we think that that's the way the world is beheld by everyone. Some of us have vision just in one eye. Some of us have to wear glasses. Some of us wear contacts. Some of us are colorblind. Oh my God, vision is not this, democratic process of looking at the world. And so he makes these people that seem more real than the people that are looking at them. In fact, it really kind of creeps you out. In a good way, as someone would say, sort of funny, ha-ha. No, funny, weird. And so it's made out of fiberglass and different other synthetic materials. And so he builds an armature, sort of a mold of what is seen that you see, and uses various synthetic, not real materials to make the stubble. This boy, it's called Boy, by the way, this boy is 5 meters high, around 15 feet high. Can you imagine how tall he would be if he stood up? At any rate, when you look at him, there's even a little bit of peach fuzz on his face. So, woman carrying sticks. Nudity alert. This is one of his sculptures. And if he stood up, he would be 12 feet tall. And when you see him, you're pretty sure that you've entered into a life drawing class, and the sky is your subject. Okay. So, this idea of how humans came about and how we look at ourselves are challenged by artists all the time, sometimes in a really uncanny way, like those other works were, and sometimes in a sort of a humorous way. And Punch, which was a very famous periodical and wonderful periodical of the 19th century in the UK, engaged, just like we engage now comically, with developments, political, social, cultural, otherwise. So you are rather long in the arm, sir, but I'll do my best to fit you, is one. And this one on the right, you probably can't read it, but it's two people talking. One's a representative of the figurative party, and the other's a representative of the literal party. And so the figurative party says, so long as I am a man, what does it matter to me whether me great-grandfather was an anthropoid or not? And the other fellow says, oh, rather disagreeable for your great-grandmother, wasn't it? That shows not necessarily that everyone was thinking as hard about Darwin's ideas as we assign them to sometimes. And we have to remember that there are degrees of humor. So I'm all for humor. Darren and I are both on the same page. All of us, I think, are on the same page on that one. Man is but a worm. You just follow it. Okay, so this is all sort of fun and stuff, and that's another sort of moment of repose. But quickly getting towards the end here, I want you to realize that the stories of natural history aren't stories of just animals, and they're not stories of humans, but they're stories of the interaction of both. And I think that everyone's been trying to relate that to you. And that sometimes pictures can tell you more than about what is happening when they include more information. So if you see that wood engraving of the guy's face in stark raving terror within the Darwin book, but all the electrodes are removed and it's sanitized, then you really don't know how that information was, obtained. And Walton Ford, again, shows us. In fact, there's little details in his work that show you that what is going on in the background of this elephant bird. Not only is the elephant bird being taken captive, but humans are being taken captive at the same time. So slavery of animals, slavery of people, of humans. This is not a real elephant, so please don't get sad. This is a sculpture that works on that level of pathos again, that we read as natural, even though it's a little bit distorted, and it's made entirely of bindi by this woman who creates sculptures, and she wants to add sort of a metaphysically, or could I say sacred aura to those sculptures. So she uses those little bits that are worn on the forehead of women in a particular cultural group in the Indian subcontinent, and she places those to make the skin of this wonderful elephant. And you know, what happens is all of a sudden she becomes really important and popular, not because of the object and her cleverness, but because it touched people in a certain way. So now all of a sudden it's at Sotheby's and it's being photographed because someone's going to buy it probably for $4 million or something like that. Art can be a trophy just as much as an elephant tusk can be a trophy. So beware. So unsung heroes, very quickly. Anna Atkins, wonderful woman, was trained as a botanist and used photography to record British algae. And she used a form called cyanotype, so she didn't have to use a bunch of emulsion and everything. She actually just dyed paper to get edges and shape, because we see plants and birds frequently. That's why you see the background being light or a great contrast, so we can know the shape of a bird or a leaf or whatever. Beautiful little book, wonderful, sweet book. Small, delicate, you can hold it. It's blue, it's wonderful. And then a 24 by 24 foot, do they still make spirographs? Did you ever play with those things? It's kind of wee, 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 and you make them. So this is 24 feet by 24 feet. It's laser etched into aluminum panels. And you walk upon it, and you can't really see anything. You get closer, and you start to see the detail. It's just like going into nature. You get closer, you see more detail. You get closer, you get closer, you get closer. Whoa. 1 million organizations around the world that are devoted to peace, to environmental stewardship, to the preservation of land for indigenous cultures. All of them together, written out in a straight line without repeating themselves, form a 24 by 24 foot object that is one made up of all those teeny tiny lines. So if you're overwhelmed suddenly by how crappy the world is, remember that there's so many organizations made up of so many people so concerned to do things that you have to make something that is potent and concentrated and everything to describe them. Okay, so why did I have you read the carbon article or essay? By the way, it's the last chapter of Primo Levi's autobiographical tale called The Periodic Table. If you didn't get curious and go look it up, but that's another question. He starts with the noble gases, and each chapter is named after an element that he had experience within the narrative in each of those chapters. And he was an Italian Jew, and he survived the Holocaust. And he ended his book with that beautiful human ecological reception of 1 atom of carbon. And you know, we can look at it different ways. We can look at it abstractly like this, or if we went to Hopewell, Ohio, and looked at the Hopewell culture, about year 1000, someone carved a piece of coal, which is primarily carbon, into a human figure. And it wasn't a fragment of a bigger human, it was just that finger. Or diamonds. You don't usually see diamonds like this. These are real diamonds. And you usually don't see diamonds like this. A wonderful miner looking for diamonds in a beautiful, almost architectural space in the 19th century. And you definitely don't see diamonds like this, which is when in 1867 they decided, oh, wow, we've got diamonds in South Africa, and there's no corporations around, let's just all go and get them. And, oh, by the way, there's a convenient workforce right there. These two images were made the same year. This is a photograph. This is a print. And there's diamonds there. And this was made in the 1990s by a Brazilian photographer named Salgado. And this is in Brazil, the Serra Pelada mine, which has both gold and diamonds, yippee. And this is the workforce that's still there. So carbon can be beautiful and can travel around like an atom and all that, but it also can reside in a little bit of grit shoved up a guy's nose that spent, you know, X number of hours, or a child, mostly child. That's why the Catholic Church changed the confirmation age, the Holy Communion age for children in France during the 19th century. So if they lowered it, children could be used as labor, because then it wasn't a sin against the church. But anyway, that's a whole nother question. And I was raised Catholic, so I can say those things. So is there primacy in sight? Are we more comfortable looking at images like this by Audubon? Do we see a Canadian goose and we think the photograph of it is more real? Or does the photograph look like a painting? And which is the painting and which is the photograph? And is the goose about sound so you don't see it, but you detect it in the sky? Or is it a song of wild geese, a Scottish tune? If you can read music, you can probably picture this tune in your head as sound. Are you picturing it? Or are you hearing it? What's operating? What sense is operating in your mind? Can you make that distinction or that decision at this particular moment? Maybe that's a way for you to start to work on reimagining the world. And so since I bummed you out a little bit, I thought that I'd end on a positive note and read you a poem on the wild geese, since I started with carbon, a finger, some diamonds, some people, some geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh, exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Thanks. So we can talk about stuff if you want, or ask questions. I'd rather you talk about it, or stuff.
I actually have a question.
Good, okay.
I wanted to ask you more about I guess it was an Italian painting, you said of the prison.
Oh, Piranesi.
Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit more about
Sure.
that?
Yeah, he was a very interesting fellow, Piranesi. He didn't make paintings, he only made etchings. So he worked in copper plates. And his father was involved in theater, and most of his family members were. And it was during the Baroque period and the Rococo period when theater became more spectacular. They figured out how to make sound by flipping metal plates and exploding lights and wind and all of that. So there was sort of a theatrical fever within his family. At the same time, and he lived in Rome. Rome was starting to collapse economically. That part of those Italian states were having a difficult time, and so they were trying to get more and more tourists to come, and the Brits were a soft touch. Oh, let's go look at ruins. But they suddenly realized that, oh my God, we've been picking at the ruins and making our own villas and houses and stuff, so maybe we should stop with that and start looking more deeply to what is there. So, context. Theater, the beginning of modern archaeology. A myth, probably true, is that his wife used to send his youngest son out with a sandwich because Piranesi was out there slobbering and drooling and with low blood sugar, trying the best he can to make what ended up being close to 5,000 etchings of substantial prowess, really, and often size, recording as fast as he could the ruins that were falling away. And they're astoundingly bizarre and beautiful. And the prisons were done in 2 states, meaning he made the plates, and 30 years later he went back to the plates and changed them to get different kinds of prints. And he made 10 of them, and he was very interested at the time in the discourse about the penitentiary systems throughout Europe, which were hideous. I mean, they suck now in a big way, and we're killing innocent people, which we just did, all the time, but they were even worse then. And so he came into contact with some activists, and not their term, my term, that were looking at pamphlets, one of which was written by a fellow named Jeremy Bentham, about how you can more humanely incarcerate someone. And so there is a relationship there to that, because he was trying to show the inhumanity, the terror that could be found in those hideous places, but mostly it was about the human imagination. And there's a beautiful essay written about that called The Dark Brain of Piranesi, and it was written by a former resident of Mount Desert Island, Marguerite Yersener. I just hideously mispronounced her name, forgive me, who wrote really very perceptively and creatively about that set of prints. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, the truth of the matter is there already are. We already live in different worlds. We don't, we don't know what it's like to live in certain places. We don't know a penguin from another penguin's life. I mean, so I guess the way I would answer that to say, what if we recognize we already did and dispense with that fear and not see it as a way of enforcing separation and differentness, but a recognition of a substantial amount of beautiful beingness in the world. And I know that sounds kind of flaky, and it does, but I already know people that are super sensitive. And I count myself among them. I mean, sometimes when I show images, I really have to collect myself because I find them so disturbing because I'm so sensitive to visual matter, visual material. However, it still exists, and it is separate from me. And the past is separate from me in the conventional and artificial ways that we construct time and space. So. I sort of am of the mind of mindfulness and rather expanding into space, which I think humans have done really well, that maybe we can not shrink, but we can be more mindful of everything, and that there already are different worlds. I'm just going to do a circle now, and that probably wasn't a really good answer, but.
Well, I think there's no answer. Anyway.
Yeah.
And my other comment was that I know you don't mean it, but it seems to me that obviously because of your background, you're giving it a priority to the visual sense and to the sight,
Right.
and to the other senses. And I wonder if for you, or whatever we think of us, cultures, others, whatever, is there a
A hierarchy in, yes. No, I do not believe in the primacy of sight. In fact, it does probably sound like it. And it's the world that I'm most comfortable in, so it's the world I express myself in. I wish that I could sit here and play you Avro part music, or, I mean, I wish and I love music, and I know music, and I love sound, and I know sound, but I deeply study what I study. So that's the ground from which I proceed in expressing and communicating. And I like the core course, even though I feel awkward sometimes in it, because I've had to crawl out of my own skin, which is really good for me, since I proclaim we all should crawl out of our skin all the time. Do as you say, not as you do. I like having these different perspectives, because I do at the same time as see parallel worlds, I do see one world, but I don't think we should strive for unity, because there is no unity, because there isn't. So I don't think that this is the most important thing in the world. I think that it can be a really important tool now at this moment, because we've got everyone's rapt attention on these electromagnetic pulses that we want in high resolution. We've got everyone's visual attention. What if we have them, we start to approach things so that there's a relationship with what it is that we're looking at that makes a proximity in some circumstances. Not in all circumstances. It's a very valuable tool in some circumstances, but it's not the only tool. And I see the screen as becoming the pilgrimage cathedral of the 21st century, as opposed to Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals in France in the 11th and 12th century. I see that we all flock to it. I flock to it. It makes me sick how much time I spend on top of that. But often it's because I'm trying to find more things to show. I wish we could all go together somewhere and look at stuff, which we will, and we do, and we shall, and all that. Oh, sorry.
Hi.
Hi.
I guess I've been thinking about like the whole like electric acid test like thing where you're all kind of sharing the same world and you're thinking and experiencing the same things, and even when you come from different worlds, when you get together like that, you sort of become one thing, and maybe you can live in other people's worlds or more than one world at the same time. Like, what do you think about that?
I've been in other cultures, if I would just address it as a cultural thing. I find it easier to be in a state of mindfulness and unadulterated beingness in the natural world more easily than I do in the cultural world. And that probably doesn't make sense to anyone, because it seems like, ooh, you know, I'd like to go to the Prado tomorrow. But I prefer the company of birds and water and mountains and all of that stuff. And it's ridiculous for me to shun that part of me that is associated to other ones of my clan. that joins us together, and it's not the proximity, it's culture. It's the objects that we make, the stories we tell each other that bring us closer to one another. That's why we do that. So I'm not saying that we can't go to Madagascar and have an authentic experience there. And I think that we have to acknowledge that there's parts of that world that we can't understand. And I think, and you can disagree with me, that is absolutely fine, and I actually would like it if you would, that I think that to think that we can fully do that is probably not a good thing. And John Visvader, I told this story in my class, but I'll tell it to you now. So you've read John's work, and the story is, of course, is that last year I was in TAB, and I'm scared to go in TAB, sorry, because of the sound. It drives me crazy, but I do go into TAB. Anyway, and I love TAB, and I love everyone in TAB. So the one of the few times that I went to TAB when I first got here, because I was scared, I walked up and there was John Visvader, and I thought, oh, thank God, because I really like John Visvader. And he had this thing on his finger. I was like, God, John, what happened to your finger? Oh, I ran into a moose. And then he told the story. And John Visvader is probably one of the individuals here that is most likely to be able to cross between worlds philosophically and in other ways, I think. And he said, yeah, I was out in the forest, and I heard, and I was, having this experience, and sort of meditating, and I heard these big, loud crunches behind me, and I turned, and there was this gigantic moose just sort of looking at me. And he said, oh, how wonderful. I'm going to commune with this moose. And before he could even get the thought finished in his own mind, the moose was charging him. And, and he was scrambling and running away from this incredibly deep, connected experience with nature, and broke his finger in that moment of panic. And that's usually when I get hit over the head with stuff. And I don't mean that in a bad way, because I've had those experiences, and I think they're authentic, I do. But every once in a while, when you think you're having it and you're quite sure you are, someone's going to come from with a 2x4 or a moose, and is going to, whack you in the side of the head. And that is that other connected part of ourselves that respond emotionally to how we are in the world. So he went from all wholeness and oneness to complete fear. Yeah,
I really like the story. But I actually think that's a true experience of nature and unity with nature, instead of being not. Because I think thinking that connection to nature and being in a true connection with the reality of nature, we tend to humanize that in a way that's, it has to be peaceful and jolly and pretty and witty. It's not like that.
Yeah, but can it be?
Nature is not, it's not how we think precisely it is. Like,
Yeah.
I think we humanize a lot what we want nature to be, or how do we want to relate to it, and we kind of distort that.
I agree totally, and I don't think it's one or the other. I'm the believer of the elliptical universe. There's not one center and one hole. There's actually a push and pull, and there's a couple centers, and you're attracted and you're repulsed, and there's a spectrum. And Western thought is so consumed with point A and point B that they forget that there's this whole journey in between. So I think that there's a reason sometimes for that. I'm not saying that it is definitely one or the other. I agree with you. And I agree with you. And if that's what you were implying, I don't agree with you then. Or I agree with you. I don't agree with you.
Okay, so when you mentioned things about the ores earlier, I do a bit about myself, and I would have to say I think there's mixed truth like that. I think I don't really think of it as ores, but I has an effect on the quality and the effect that comes out.
Mm-hmm.
And that life is an investment that you can put into it.
So we all have different ways of telling a tale, and see, truth is a very dangerous word, because truth to humans, particularly in the Western world, truth is one thing, and truth is really relative. I mean, truth is another human construct, really. I mean, I'm not saying, I also agree with you. And I don't mean that just to be silly and flip, but I really, I mean, I'm acknowledging the fact that we do have some common ground and we fall on it all the time. And it's nice when we draw the little fire and gather around it and stuff, but we can't completely dissolve into that, and that's it. I don't believe in the total dissolution of identity, because identity is a very important thing. Like that. Anyone else? Okay, let's eat. Thank you.